Hey everybody, it's Chuck Burr, your Nebraska Extension Educator located in west central Nebraska. Here today in our UNL TAPS plots, talking today with Dr. Brian Krienke. Brian is a postdoc with the UNL TAPS program, and I'm going to talk to him a little bit about nitrogen management. So Brian, the last several years we've looked at what the optimal rate of nitrogen was for our UNL TAPS plots here in the pivot corn competition, and it's ranged like 100 pounds difference depending on what year you're working in. So first of all, why would we have that big of a range, and what can we do about that?
So thanks, Chuck, for that question. That's one of the difficulties with nitrogen is that you restart every year. It's not like your other macronutrients like phosphorus, for example, that really sticks around in your soil every year and then you get to use from that bank. With nitrogen, you start over because it's a leachable nutrient. And so, but unlike those other nutrients, it's really hard to predict ahead of time what you're going to need because we don't have a soil test calibration that accurately tells you at the beginning of the season how to project in for the rest. And the reason why we don't have something like that, and the reason why 100 pounds can be your optimum, the difference of optimums between years, is because of how the soil mineralizes the organic matter, which contains nitrogen, but it's not available to a plant. And so the weather has a huge role to play in that. The soil moisture also plays a significant role, temperature primarily. And so your optimums can change from one year to the next simply based on weather. The other big thing, TAPS, everybody gets to choose their hybrid. Well, every hybrid responds differently to nitrogen. There are some, of course, that respond similarly to each other, but we don't know that ahead of time. There might be regional generalizations that might be able to be made for certain hybrids, but then you put it in a specific field in a given year and the prediction isn't what you thought. And so there's so much uncertainty built in then when we're talking about nitrogen recommendations. It's really one of the most challenging nutrients to manage from that perspective.
So Brian, you mentioned hybrid influence on nitrogen need. Tell me a little more about that.
Well, so part of my PhD research and then part of the research ongoing on the center here is hybrid by N interactions. And what we found then, and we're finding now in the TAPS data, is that hybrid has a significant influence on the response to applied nitrogen. And so even hybrids that are categorized by the company that are supposed to be either highly responsive or not so much, don't always pan out that way when you put them in a specific location. And so maybe regionally, across multiple states, these hybrids have some generalized trends that would average out, but it's always difficult when you put it into a new soil environment, new weather environment. The hybrid doesn't always respond how you think it is. And so there's a lot of variability then that can be influenced simply because you have different germplasm.
So Brian, a couple of weeks ago we did a session on our UNL nitrogen calculator, and that's a tool for producers to use to kind of get them in the ballpark, where they need to be in terms of total nitrogen for the season. And I've had actually a couple growers tell me that the UNL nitrogen calculator is too conservative. They're putting on more nitrogen than they really need.
Well, Chuck, I would completely agree with them. The way the UNL algorithm was developed was regional based, at least for Nebraska and Nebraska's soils and conditions, predominantly irrigated environments and responsive environments. So if you have a fairly unresponsive site, say after soybean residue, it's typically going to overestimate. Now the algorithm has various credits that are subtracted off of that initial kind of calculation, if you will. But the algorithm was never meant to be a precision tool. It was meant to be the best average universally that could be applied across Nebraska, because that in the era it was created, that's what it was for. So what I like to think of with the algorithm is it's a great starting place if you're trying to look at how to start trimming how much nitrogen you're putting on. If you're putting on more than the algorithm, I would say see if you can dial it back at least to the algorithm. And then once you get there, that's where we start to get into more precision technologies and monitoring more closely when you're timing and how much you're putting on in any one time.
Great. So Brian, I guess the next question is, once we're in season, what kind of tools can we use? What kind of things do the TAPS participants have access to help them really dial in that nitrogen, make sure we're not shorting it, but not putting on too much either?
So the great thing about TAPS is all these industry representations of tools that are available. So there's many different aerial imagery companies providing their services to TAPS participants. So go to taps.unl.edu to check those out. There's also some computer models. Play around with these tools. What are they telling you? Are they encouraging you to put on more or less? And then come look at your corn visually. We post photo updates, periodically, but come look at your plots, get in here and see if you can see some differences. As far as what UNL is going to collect for data that we're going to provide for you, there's a sensing platform in which one of Dr. Rutnick's PhD students is going to sense with some frequency. He's using an active crop sensor to monitor rows periodically, and so we will also provide that information as to what is the status in terms of nitrogen of your crop.
Tell me more about the sensors that are on it. How do you utilize that information?
So Abia, a student of Darren, he set this thing up. He's got a thermal sensor, he's got infrared sensors, a multitude of crop canopy sensors, active sensors. And what we're trying to do is we're trying to separate out all these effects that are interacting, right? It's rarely is nitrogen the only issue you're managing. And I say that tongue-in-cheek because it's never the only issue a farmer's dealing with. And so we're trying to separate water, hybrid, nitrogen. All these things are interacting and making it really hard to come to conclusions on one particular management case, as an example. And so these sensors are gathering rich amounts of data to help us do that, essentially.
So Brian, the other thing we need to talk about is your article, your tips from TAPS you just produced. What can producers find out when they read that?
So the tips for TAPS is really just, I thought I was going to go one direction with it, and I ended up just coming back to the basic fact that everything I'm seeing from last year, it seems like everybody, for the most part, over-applied nitrogen. How can that be when most of the rates were 150, some were far higher than that. The UNL algorithm was 150. Now the reason I say that is because there's no trend. And there's quite a bit of variation. That's hybrid. Water, of course, is also a part of that. But it was responsive to nitrogen. The control yield was 82 bushels per acre. So you put nitrogen on, you do get an increased yield. However, it's plateauing before any of the rates that were being used in that study. And so on average, the participants, I think, were 40 pounds over the UNL algorithm. And so you'll remember if you were a contestant last year where that put you. But on average, we're still above a UNL algorithm, which is meant to be conservative and not short yield. So it's time to consider dialing things back, being more realistic. And this is the perfect environment to do it, right? You don't have to worry about losing your farm here. So tinker with it, try to crank that efficiency down, and see if you can learn from it.
So the other thing we'll be doing here, probably in about a week, is taking tissue samples, the ear leaf nitrogen, and that information will be provided to our participants as well. So again, another piece of information for them to use to make good decisions. This has been Chuck Burr with another TAPS video series.